Okay, I just wanted to talk through our assignments and what we're doing at present on Bentham. So there was this task on determinism and free will. There was a closed passage at the beginning of it, and you just have to pop in a conclusion at the end. So I'm not expecting a huge amount on that, but it would be good to see that done. I think Bill's done it, the rest haven't. So you just simply have to go in and you fill out this closed passage here with words that are at the bottom. Then you listen to this video here. The second task is there are chapters, the chapter in my book 225 to 228, which you read on this topic, but it's just copied and pasted for you down here. Just have a read of that so you understand Calvin and Arminius. And then when it comes to the conclusion there at the end, you simply add in your own conclusion. There are two essays to read on determinism and free will, and that would be useful if you could just read that through at your own leisure. That would be great. The other assignment that you've been given is one on the discussion that we had at length on Bentham, and I see that we just got one in at the moment. That's a bit disappointing. Can we, I know I just want really short answers to this. Bill's done this here very well. So, just have a look at working your way through those questions on Bentham, really getting to know Bentham. I know it seems intimidating because there are 26 of them, but 27 of them. But if you just give short answers to that, that would be great to see. The other thing to look at is under files, and I'm just going to talk through now under utilitarianism materials, notes on a book by Roger Crisp about Mill on utilitarianism. And these notes here, I'm just going to talk through, and what I'd like you to do is to just post up a question that arises from this. So the first thing to say is that Mill's autobiography and his thought are very much interconnected. He's due a place in the history of philosophy alongside Kant and Aristotle, really. He's that significant for British philosophy and for law, for issues of ethics. He really is innovative in his thinking. His father was a philosopher, and also he took up his father's job in the East India Company when his father got promoted. So he was a kind of bureaucrat in the East India Company for decades, really, and wrote along that time. He was greatly influenced, his father was, by Locke, the English empiricist philosopher, and he believed that children were born up with a blank slate, and so sought to engineer his son, in a sense, to be an architect of public change in terms of the law and our outlook, to sort of bring Bentham's project to Parliament, to public policy, and he was largely successful with that. But he was home educating his son in quite a dominating manner, and he read Greek aged 3, did Mill, and he was able to correct his father's writing on the history of India at 11. So prodigious talent. Bentham was a hedonist, and he focused on pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters that nature has placed us under the governance of. And Mill was able to hear from the horse's mouth, as it were, listening directly over several summers to Bentham and his project as a teenager. But he suffered a kind of burnout from at the age of 20, partly because of his intense homeschooling and the fact that his whole life had been about this utilitarian project. And he found solace in the poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge, and he was starting to read some other writers like Auguste Comte and Tocqueville on America and democracy. So he wasn't allowed to attend Cambridge and instead embarked on a legal education under the utilitarian lawyer John Austin. And he founded an influential think tank called the Utilitarian Society. In 1830, he met Harriet Taylor and fell in love with her. She was married, but in 1851, after her husband died, 2 years later, they married. And she was a real intellectual companion for him and balanced his life in many ways. She was a feminist, and together they wrote The Subjugation of Women, which is published in 1869 and pushed for universal suffrage, or certainly for extension of the right to vote for women. And he was an advocate of reform in education and the legal system. He very much believed that if you could elevate people's critical faculties in education, then that would be for the good of all. And Bentham, of course, invented a new prison, and Mill was sort of taking forward these ideas. He was an important figure in British socialism, worked closely with Gladstone, and he proposed that the word man on a bill extend to the vote to all householders and be replaced by the word person. While this was defeated, he did move things forward. So he lived in France for a while and spoke French. And at the heart of this philosophy is an attempt to be an empiricist, like John Locke, like Jeremy Bentham, to bring things down to earth, to stop rooting ethics and morality in natural law theory that Thomas Aquinas had initiated, or intuitionism, this sense that there are in our conscience or our intuitions strong enough senses of moral order to proceed, that these are reliable and universal, and you can trust your intuitions about right and wrong. They're kind of innate and inbuilt. And he was skeptical about this and wanted a far more empirical measure of right and wrong. So he's inductive about ethics. He thinks that it's based upon probabilities, not proofs. It's based upon observations of people's behavior. What do they orientate themselves towards? Are they aiming for happiness and pleasure in their actions? If that's the case, then we can properly infer that this is the end to which all ethical calculations should focus, and all energies focus. Now, he can equivocate, be a little ambiguous between pleasure and happiness. But broadly what he does is he broadens out, gives a more holistic account of pleasure than Bentham does. He wants to say that, Bentham often has a very homogeneous, single measure of pleasure. And he wants to say, well, there's usefulness in rules, there's usefulness in character development, there's usefulness in education, there's usefulness in our fellow sympathy for human beings. All of these have utility, and we should take them into account. And we are in danger of swine morality, as Carlyle called it, just treating people like pigs, when morality and pleasure and happiness are more complex than that. He'd read enough Aristotle to comprehend the broadness with which we should understand this term happiness, or eudaimonia. He's a consequentialist, so he thinks in terms of outcomes, and this isn't necessarily anti-Christian. It's certainly a humanist philosophy. Mill thought that Jesus was a rule utilitarian, that where the rules became oppressive, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Where rules became oppressive, then you could reform them, change them. In 1833, he wrote an essay on Bentham, which we spent a lot of time looking at, and Here are some features of Bentham's utilitarianism. So it's hedonistic, it's focused on pleasure and maximizing it. And it's very much, you can weigh all pleasures on this hedonic calculus, calculus of felicity. You can weigh all of the different pleasures of life and give them each a value in that scale. They're all homogeneous enough to do that with. Mill says, no, they're not. Pleasure is complex. There are pleasures of the mind that are qualitatively different to pleasures of the body. So there's a certain psychology to this. If you begin with observations, you can look at people's behavior and see that they do act out of self-interest, and altruism isn't possible for Bentham. He reads Adam Smith and thinks, The Economist, and thinks, that's very much the view that psychology is connected there. So altruism isn't possible. Human beings are self-interested, and they act for their own interests, often for reputation. Even when they act for religious motives, it might be for the reputation of how they're viewed by others. He's an act utilitarian. You look at individual acts and you maximize the goodness in those acts. And he's measuring this with a scientific method, as we've said. He's trying to sort of mimic the sciences in his measuring of pleasure. And it's a quantitative view of pleasure. Each is interested to count equally, and pushpin is as good as poetry. Whatever gives someone pleasure is kind of what they, how they view things, but you can analyze it collectively in terms of their calculus of felicity. There are sanctions that can be employed to sort of pull people into line, or that do generally box people in. Physical sanctions, like our behavior can kind of have physical impact upon us. Mill says that whilst people should orientate to the higher pleasures, often they don't through weakness of will. And they might drink heavily, and then they'd realize that that's damaging to their health. And so that would be a physical sanction. A political sanction, the legal system can limit people's freedoms. They might think it's very pleasurable to break the speed limit if they're young boy racers, but the legal system can limit that. And there are popular sanctions. People can express their opinion if others are being antisocial. And in religious sanctions, then your good or bad behavior might be frowned upon or applauded within that. Now, there are lots of problems with hedonism here. We'll list just 6 of them. We talked about Robert Nozick's experience machine. If you were locked in this pleasure machine, would you feel this was a worthy life? Mill uses the term noble. How noble would you feel locked in your pleasure machine, knowing that you were doing no good to anybody else? That would be problematic. And what about the idea of the sadistic torturer who gets a lot of pleasure from torturing people? That's a problem with hedonism. Also, psychological egoism, that people are generally selfish and that altruism isn't possible. Well, we do see examples of soldiers laying down their lives for others, or the selflessness of mothers is a good counter-argument to this. But Bentham might reply that, well, they're looking for a different type of pleasure, and that's self-esteem that comes from selfless acts, or they want their memory, their legacy to be a good one. But that's not always true. Sometimes people act very selflessly and die in obscurity as a result of that. So that's problematic. There are problems with act utilitarianism because of the problem of integrity. You can do one thing in one setting and another thing that's completely contrary to it in another. So you can move from moment to moment, act to act, without any consistency. And that, what does that do to your character? is sometimes you're running with the horses, sometimes you're running with the foxes, and that's a problem. And it can be too demanding. If you're responsible for everything that you don't do because the outcomes are the same, then if you don't give your $3,400 to the anti-malarial charity, are you then responsible for the deaths of people that would otherwise have lived if you'd given that money? So those are problems. And is quantity the only thing that counts? Mill is going to go on and say that pleasure matters as well as pain. Now, Bentham in this book here has a reasonably long essay, Mill on Bentham, and there are quite a few pages on this that are worth reading through. So there's actually 16 of these. I haven't got time to go through them here now, but I might do a separate video just introducing them to you. So if today you can try and crack on with the exercises on Bentham, and then there's another document that we're going to work on this week, and I'll just go back to this document here. So if we just look at utilitarianism materials, and then Dr. Brown-Latz's notes on Mill, what I want us to go on to this week is to write down your thoughts as you read each chapter of Mill. So if you go to Mill's Utilitarianism, it begins on page 181 with general remarks, and then it goes on to chapter 1, what utilitarianism is, or chapter 2, what utilitarianism is. So 1, general remarks; 2, what utilitarianism is. And what you need to do is to read the chapter through, see the chapter summary, and then write your thoughts on each of these chapters, and we'll discuss that. So in today's lesson, I'll be available. We can chat things through, but we do need to make progress with our assignments. And if you have any questions, do pop them up, either about utilitarianism, and if they're good questions, then I'll open up a discussion in the lesson today. It's really important to interact and to chew these ideas over and to look at probe the strengths and weaknesses of different thinkers as we go through this course. So hopefully we'll see you in the lesson and we can chat then.